The Late Morning Program with Nam Ras Podcast.
Hare Krishna, everyone. You're listening to the number one Hare Krishna podcast in the world with your host, Nam Ras. I'm here with Lalita Madhava Prabhu. Lalita Madhava Prabhu, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me, Nam Ras ji.
Yes,
it's awesome.
Yes, it's awesome to talk to you. So the reason I brought Lalita Madhava Prabhu on is because he has already done his PhD and his PhD thesis at the University of Oxford on Bhaktivinoda Thakura. So I just wanted to kind of pick his brain regarding the whole thing because it's fascinating for us devotees who are followers of Bhaktivinoda Thakura. It's really fascinating when someone does like a real deep academic study on any acharya and kind of really gets some more information that'd be really interesting to share with our listeners. So maybe we could start out, Prabhu, with maybe a little bit your background, because I like to make the late morning program a little bit personal, kind of, and get the background of the person before we get into the topic. So tell us like kind of where you grew up and how that was.
Okay. So to begin from the beginning, I guess I was born in Singapore. Cool. My mom's actually English, though. She found herself in Singapore at some time in the late 70s and got married with a Singapore Chinese man, my father. So my mom's background actually is she's a Srila Prabhupada disciple. She joined around 1971 in London, at Bury Place. And she, along with my two older sisters and my brother, we were raised, I guess, by the time she was in Singapore, by her own admission, she wasn't leading a strict Krishna conscious life, but it was definitely a notable feature of our upbringing in terms of it. It was a kind of like my mom sort of still carries with her to this day a real, how to say, like just simple-hearted faith in Srila Prabhupada. He made a deep impression on her,
Wow.
And so that was, we would say prayers at night and go to the temple once in a while in Singapore. Of course, Singapore is one of the, I think, one of only two, I believe, places in the world that didn't let Srila Prabhupada enter the country.
Really? I didn't know.
I think one of the reasons for that was, I've been told, is that, enthusiastic disciples came to Singapore before Srila Prabhupada was coming.
Oh, I did hear that.
Yeah. And there was, there's a large Tamil community in Singapore, Hindu Tamil, and there's all this preaching against demigod worshippers for the less intelligent, etc. So the Hindu community there got together and said, this is not happening in Singapore.
Very interesting.
There are still, of course, devotees in Singapore, and they're kind of, wonderful devotees as well. But so we would go to the temple once in a while. But other than that, it was a fairly, kind of a very sort of a light, enthusiastic, Krishna conscious background that's instilled in me, I guess you could say, kind of enthusiasm, and curiosity. It wasn't in any way forced or anything. It was very light. So I was there till about 11 years old, and then we came to England, moved to England, and I ended up in boarding school in Oxford and then in Shropshire, and all of that. And then what happened was, at 18, much to my resistance, there was a great resistance to it, but I ended up having to go back to Singapore for my national service for 2.5 years. It is over there in the army.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So it's like kind of like Israel. Like you have to, whoever is a part of the whoever's a citizen, you have to do some service.
Exactly, it's exactly like that actually. Singapore is actually trained. The Singapore army was trained by the Israeli army, and kind of similar mentality in terms of, it's a small, tiny little country. It feels in the midst of potential aggressors.
Right.
It's a fairly successful place, and so it's got a lot to guard. And so they're very strict about people going back to serve their country, to do their time, and I really didn't want to go back, and I really resisted it, and I was in a bit of denial about the fact that I was going to have to go back. But in the end, sort of, screaming and kicking and even a bit of crying, I ended up having to go back to Singapore and enter the, there were even plans on the first day of getting into the basic training course, military training course, which is the first 3 months of it, calling my mum up and saying, get me on one of these boats. I want to escape. It's on a little island. On a fishing boat. I'm gonna escape or something. But it ended up being a great blessing for me. It was kind of being taken out of the scene in England. I would have probably ended up at university, and I would have ended up at university for sure, but not necessarily taking it very seriously and getting involved in who knows what, because I've got slight hedonistic tendencies.
The Cooley style, yeah.
But it was, I just sort of intuitively, very deeply, it was when I first arrived back in Singapore for the service. My sister was living there at the time, and she brought me to 1 or 2 devotee programs there. And there was a couple of weeks before I started the the whole sort of 2 years or 2.5 year stint, and I just knew intuitively, okay, pack my bags for the training, and I put in my big bag, which I had never really chanted regularly up until then, here and there, spits and spats, and at Isho Upanishad, because we had lots of books at home in Singapore, which I'd sort of, tried to read the Bhagavad Gita a couple of times, but always got, stuck at the first chapter, essentially. All the names are just, utterly bewildering up until that point. I would just put it down. Okay. But that was when, okay, I'm going to take this seriously now. And those 2, well, it ended up being 2 years, and then I disrupted and whatever. But those 2 years, kind of, that was really the beginning of me owning my spiritual life, there wasn't anything else to do. Essentially, it was really boring and terrible. So kind of how
I know you is a number of years ago, some devotees, because the opening of the Sri Caitanya Saraswat Mutt in London, in London near Heathrow. I came with my father-in-law because he was invited, and so I think I might have met you or met your brother.
Yeah, I met you there for sure. I remember having lunch with you there.
Okay, yeah. So I met you there, and then so tell us how you got in touch with that institution.
Yeah, okay. So towards the end of my time in Singapore, I made a trip. Well, actually, sorry. First of all, the beginning of it, I guess you could say, was there was a friend of my sister had left a book at our house. Up until that point, I'd been reading all of Srila Prabhupada's books, Bhagavatam, all the, et cetera, et cetera. But a book by someone I had never heard of or seen before called Follow the Angels by Srila Sridhar Maharaj.
Right.
And I tried to read it. It was a totally different style, and but I felt very, very charming, very poetic, but it didn't quite. I didn't quite grasp it at that. I mean, I still haven't quite grasped it. But it was a little bit above my head. However, I met a devotee on the street there one day from Colombia. We made friends, and he ended up bringing me towards the end of my army time, to Navadip, to the Caitanya Saraswat Mutt there, and that's the first time I met who would become my Gurudev, Srila Govinda Maharaj.
Wow.
It was another year before that was in the midst of the Gaur Purnima celebrations, and there were a lot of devotees and all, and I find those situations sometimes a bit bewildering when there's too many things going on, and trying to in a place for the first time, and I really sort of just observed, essentially. I observed, but I bought a whole load of books and came back and and I ended up reading a lot of Srila Sridhar Maharaj at the time, and then I came to England and started university in 2003, and hooked up with some of the devotees of the Caitanya Saraswat Mutt while I was here. still not sure who I was going to be aligning myself with. I was kind of exploring, going to various places, and I ended up going to India 2004 that summer. That was quite key. At first, I was stayed in an ashram at the place of the Dandabanga pastimes, the breaking of the staff of a disciple of Gaur Govinda Maharaj. Sachinandan Prabhu had started an ashram there, a beautiful, but it was, very sort of idyllic, no running water, no electricity, kind of really quite a mystic. I'd stayed a month there, ended up also, I think it was Purushottam Mas that year. I ended up with the Narayan Maharaj people as well in Puri for a while, because Dandabanga is fairly close to Puri, so with them for a few weeks, and then ended up going to the Caitanya Saraswat Mat in Navadip. First Calcutta to ask permission to go to Navadip from Govinda Maharaj, and then ended up in Navadip and was given the service of listening and editing out kind of like extraneous noises of the audio recordings of Srila Govinda Maharaj. And it was upon listening to him talk about the passing of Srila Haridas Thakur, his explanation of that, and there was something about that just really moved me. He said, just to recap very quickly, he said, this is the greatest proof that Mahaprabhu is God, is Krishna himself, and that Haridas Thakur, his whole life he's chanting, 3 lakh naam every day, but at the time of his departure he chants Shri Krishna Chaitanya.
Wow. Beautiful. What was your relationship like with Srila Govinda Maharaj? You had a lot of interaction, because I know he left this world in late 2000s or
2010. He 2010. He departed in 2010. I was, so by the time I had come to the Mat, there was a fairly large following. Right, and I was kind of in the sort of Antya Leela, so to speak.
Right.
It was I was on the margins. I was really at the same time, it was wonderful to be in his presence. But I was a shy boy. I'm still a shy boy, but at times. But quiet and kind of with much trepidation, putting myself before him and all of that. But he was very. If I wish I'd been a bit bolder, really, because he was a very super affectionate person,
right.
Very informal. It was a really like a very much a family vibe there in his veranda, but it was just, I think I was daunted by the crowd, there was all the people being around for a long time, so all of that. But my connection really was formed in London with the devotees there.
Right.
And by the final parts of the final year really of Gurudev's life, I got quite involved in that temple that you came to see the opening of. That was we've been trying to acquire a place for a long time, for about 50 years. Gurudev said it was his last headache, so in the end I found myself intensely involved in that, and that was it was quite a mystical, tragic and mystical and happy thing all at the same time. In that we ended up getting the place, or I signed the deal for it that day, and didn't even have time to tell Gurudev, because he departed that evening. It's like without
wait, hold on a second. What? When you closed on the
closed the deal, closed on the deal, and then got a call that evening from someone called Nyasi Maharaj, and he said, Gurudev is departed. It was really like it was all kinds of things.
Wow.
All kinds of things, but it was mystical, very very mystical.
Yeah.
That was an interesting moment.
Wow.
Yeah. But so that's kind of my connection with the Caitanya Saraswat Mat. It's been my spiritual home, and that was also at that point. Then that was another. I ended up starting my PhD just a few months later. And kind of, in a sense, kind of withdrew from intense mission life at that point. It was, right. I've been, again, on the fringes of my own community for the past decade now, I guess you could say, but I still love all the devotees and have much affection for you know,
Sure.
but I've been doing my academic thing really for a while now.
Yeah. So, so when you started your academic career, did you know that you wanted to do a PhD, and did you know you wanted to do it in Bhaktivinoda Thakur?
No, not at all. I started doing it in philosophy.
Okay.
I was in London doing philosophy, and kind of I didn't think I was ever going to be an academic as such. I was never like a nerdy person at school, you know. And I'm still not.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, I was definitely not. I was into, you know, the music and sports and, you know, whatever else, you know, all the fun stuff. But I did get into that. Gave me the opportunity to do an Indian philosophy course, and also a dissertation on Achintya Bheda Bhed. You know, you know, I mean, to go back a little bit, that so the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies, when Shaunak Rishi Prabhu, and there was a lady called Hari at the time who was helping him, when they first came to Oxford to look for a place, to look for a building, they were put in touch with my mum, you know, as a devotee living in the Oxford area at the time.
I see. Right.
I knew about the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies since since the beginning, and I used to look at them there, the scholars in the centre doing, like, you can do a PhD on Jiva Goswami, that was at the time Radhika Raman Prabhu.
Oh, I see. Right.
Well, that's crazy. So there was like a little, you know, little interest, you know. But I was in London doing philosophy. It seemed really far off, and then I ended up transitioning to the study of religion, which doesn't sound like a big move, you know, to people outside of those domains, but conceptually it was a little bit difficult to sort of, for me at least, to make that, you know, you've been dealing in the realm of pure ideas, you know, kind of, you know, like and then suddenly finding myself doing religious history, which was much more messy, you know. It's you know, there's no I don't know, like black or white there. It's all a bit yeah, history is a messy thing. So I ended up doing my master's at the School of Oriental and African Studies next door to the University College London, where I did my undergrad, and ended up doing more Gaudiya stuff there. I wrote a dissertation on the relationship between the Madhvas and the Gaudiyas.
Oh, wow!
On Achintya Bheda Bhed at the time. Yeah. So
hold on, that really interests me. What's the premise there? For that dissertation, but the relationship between Madhvas and Gaudiyas?
Of my dissertation?
What was like the main point?
Yeah, I was trying to establish so some see it as a sort of purely a formal connection, you know, or if there is any connection at all, you know, some dispute that there is any connection, and it's really just for convenience in the early 18th century. When Baladeva Dibushan sort of establishes that, but I was trying to establish in that context that there is a more substantive relationship. You know, I mean, at the time there was a devotee called Krishna Sharana, or Kiyo Kazuo Kita, writing his doctoral dissertation on that subject, and his work infinitely surpasses my own in that area. So if you want to, you know, explore that, I would wow. Direct you to his book. He's done an amazing book there. It's kind of, you know, the definitive piece, I think, on that. Yeah. And
then when you got your master's first, and then you decided to do PhD.
I decided to do it. Well, actually, in between that, I had to go back to Singapore for another 6 months in the army. You know,
really?
Yeah, another 6, because I ended up over there. You can do a disruption. You take after 2 years, you can study, you know, and then you can come back and do the remaining 6 months.
Right.
So, I mean, in the meantime, they had actually abolished that extra 6 months that people have to do, but I ended up, it wasn't retroactive, so I was there doing it anyways. And I was there, it was at that time I thought, okay, yeah, I might give. I got a good grade for my master's, and I thought, I think I'm not done with this. I want to continue studying Gaudiya stuff. You know, I'm not really cut out for temple life as such. You know, I love it. I love being in temples, you know, but this is a way I think to keep engaged with the tradition.
According to your propensity.
According to my propensity, for sure, definitely.
Yeah.
It's a kind of academia is a kind of discourse. It's definitely not, it's testing, it's not devotional as such at all. But I like the challenge of it.
I think it's important that devotees go into that realm, because there should be devotees everywhere, kind of like in their hands, or not one person, but like different devotees in different places, just to be able to have some representation in the academic community. I know there's a lot of devotees who are studying various things and PhDs and whatnot. I think it's an important thing. I think Prabhupada, he told some devotees to go to university and I guess do their preaching or do their sharing, whatever you want to call it, in that field.
Yeah. I think it's important. It's maybe the sign of like a maturing tradition as well, that you have,
right?
Kind of, it's sort of, this is a longer term project, really, isn't it? It's embedding yourself in culture as well. You're and to have devotees in positions, as lecturers, as professors, fully trained academics, essentially supervising and shaping the study of
right.
Gaudiya Vaishnavism and Hinduism more broadly. I think it's if we don't do it, others are going to do it. And I think it's important to have our voice in that domain. It's an important, because these things, it might seem obscure, right? The realm of academia. It's like but these things do trickle down, and they shape conceptions about whatever, so I think there's definitely a place for it. And important,
for sure.
Yeah.
Is your goal kind of to become a professor?
I'm at a bit of a crossroads at the moment. I've completed the doctorate, and I've got all this work here at the moment with the center. I've got the plans to turn the thesis into a book, and I've got these other research projects going on, and I'm involved there. But I've also got, sort of, like I'm not, my dad's, I've got businessman roots in my genes as well. I mean,
really?
I'm not a businessman, but, like there's to do things in the world.
Entrepreneurship.
Maybe that, I don't know, maybe I'm totally deluded, but, there's those kinds of, I do, that comes also perhaps more naturally to me than academia does.
Oh, interesting.
Creating stuff, doing, I've been fighting it for a long time, but turning 40, soon, and realizing, maybe this is actually, it's actually I just wanted to mention briefly. I mentioned my mom, my dad. He's not a devotee as such, and has had kind of interesting relationships with the devotees. But there was a guy I stumbled across, just randomly heard a bit of a snippet of a show that you did a while back with one devotee who was talking about, I think, being away out of the movement for a while, and then he came back. But
Govardhan Das, he left for 10 years.
And was his dad involved in Singapore doing printing of books with Hansadutta? There was someone on the show talking about that. There was
really?
But I forget his name now. But I was just going to say that they would have been printing at my dad's or my grandfather's printing company, because my dad ended up printing the that black Bhagavatam set.
Yeah, the black Bhagavatam set.
The first one. Yeah, that was printed by my dad back in the day in the early 80s by Hansadutta. The funny story there is that Hansadutta Swami at the time was sort of representing himself as representative of the BBT.
Right.
That when it came to invoicing the BBT said, "Oh no, he's not actually a representative." So it ended up being it was it's a funny turn of events that. But,
so your dad was a part of the printing. He had a printing company.
Yeah, printing company, and essentially, through no choice of his own, it was a bit of an embarrassment, but ended up donating all those Bhagavatams to the world, because Hansadutta never paid. It was about $1 million. The whole company was
$1 million. $1 million.
$1 million.
Wow.
So, Anyhow, that's a side point.
I love that kind of history. Anyways, so tell us a little bit about when it started that you decided Bhaktivinoda Thakur is something I'd love to do my dissertation on like hundreds of pages of writing and thought and, all kinds of things.
Gosh. Okay, so I would say that when I was doing my undergraduate thing, I came across at the Soho Street Temple, their bookshop there, there's a book by Shukavak Das called The Hindu Encounter with Modernity, or Hindu Encounter with Modernity. Kedarnath Datta Bhaktivinoda. It was all about Bhaktivinoda. It was that's the first major piece of scholarship that was written about Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakura in the English language, academic work at least. And I read that and sort of devoured it as such. I found it super inspiring, and it really, I didn't think at the time about writing on Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakura, but that provided me with a framework by which I could navigate academia. His whole treatment of what Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakura is doing in, his Krishna, at least, the analysis was rooted in his Krishna Samhita at first, an early text by Bhaktivinoda Thakura. But how Shukavak was explaining what Bhaktivinoda Thakura was doing there, in that sort of, sort of finding place for reason within the tradition, and at the same time safeguarding the realm of faith, the transcendent nature of Krishna, but yet making room for the critical application of reason in certain domains, in the phenomenal domain. I found that really inspiring, and I got that allowed me to navigate the academic realm as such, and that your belief in a blue cowherd god is kind of, I don't know, it's to sort of hold on to that in the context of like the jungle of philosophies that we get encountered, that we encounter in the context of the academy.
That book kind of like changed your mind, and kind of not changed your mind, but inspired you to do this.
It definitely shaped me. But then what happened was, when I was thinking to do a PhD, I approached Shaunaka Rishi at the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies.
Yeah.
And at the time, he was very encouraging of me doing something, and he steered me in the direction of doing something on Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakura. He's been at the OCHS. He's been shaping a sort of Gaudiya studies program implicitly for quite a few years now. With people working on different figures, different texts, different themes, and he felt that Bhaktivinoda Thakura was someone an important figure that someone needed to study, and so. When he proposed that, I went away and thought, yeah, no problem. I thought that would be amazing to do that, an honor, a great honor. And I got excited about it and wrote a proposal. Oxford accepted it, and I began. As it also so happened at the time, I was very, very fortunate in that Ferdinando Sardella and Abhishek Ghosh, or Krishna Abhishek and Pranava Prabhu, both academics, and Pranava was doing his thesis on Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati, and Abhishek at the time was doing it on Prabhupada, Saraswati Thakur, and Bhaktivinoda, and ended up shifting just to Bhaktivinoda. But they had, along with a few others, I don't know all the details of the history there, but come into this gold mine of an archive through the descendants of one of the great scholars of the Gaudiya Math, Sundarananda Bhaktivinoda. So some of his descendants had essentially what happened when the Gaudiya Math broke up, would have been in the 40s this happened. Sundarananda Bhaktivinoda, who was like the editor of the Gaudiya and, like a key person in, producing all the works of the Math, he took the personal library of Saraswati Thakur and fled in the end to Dhaka. And I believe there it remained for a good number of decades. But then his somehow or other, Pranava Prabhu, and then Krishna Abhishek, and I don't know the whole history there. They can correct me later. They had been offered it in some way, and that
you can have this library.
Yeah, that someone needs to take care of it. The family of Sundarananda. There's thousands of volumes there. But it was a treasure trove, of Gaudiya material relating specifically to the project I was about to undertake. So it's really by their grace and others involved. Harisawi Prabhu ended up sort of managing that project, I began my PhD just as that was really taking shape in the early days of what became the Bhaktivedanta Research Center.
Oh yes, I've been there
in Kolkata. You've seen, first editions of a whole spectrum of Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakura and Saraswati, unpublished material, the second unpublished part of the Saraswati Jayashri on Bhakti Siddhanta, the personal journal of Srila Saraswati Thakur, manuscripts, unpublished works of Bhaktivinoda Thakur. It was quite
wow,
quite incredible, really. The first opportunity I got, I made a trip there naturally I began to think about how what I was going to do. Of course, it's also, to be encountered with that sort of like wealth of material is very bewildering. Like my at the time, and still, but a bit better now. But my Bangla skills were really just taking shape. I had a bit of a Sanskrit background, so I had to work pretty hard to sort of like get up to speed a little bit, but still very like what I was gonna, okay, so you have the broad topic, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur. My colleague Gopinath Acharya Prabhu, or Rembert Lutjahams, who's a great scholar at the OCHS and did his work on Kavi Karnapur, he asked me recently, what would you have done differently? Sorry, I'm hearing echo. Sorry. Would you have done the same project again? Now with the knowledge that you've got about how it went. And I said, it's a difficult one. Probably, what made my project difficult was, you've got a personality, but like, how do you turn that into an argument? A thesis is meant to be an angle on something.
Right.
And I think it would have been easier to have begun with an issue, to have begun with a question, on something or other. And that would have been at least a quicker PhD, because I ended up taking a long time for my PhD.
Longer than it was meant to be.
Longer than it was meant to be. But, I was doing other things. I think life happens as well, and it takes however long it takes. And,
right. but that's a good segue into what did you end up making the argument?
Yeah. So the argument essentially was I turned the observation itself into the argument in essence, in that there's just so much of Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, so much diversity, and so I ended up, I felt that, there's been since Shukavak wrote his book, there's been quite not loads, but like a number of, substantive monographs on Bhakti, PhDs. There was Jason Fuller's, Varuni. There's existing body of scholarship that I came to and I read, and obviously was dependent on, and that really allowed me to do my work. But at the same time, what I noticed was there was a fairly kind of like limited selection of texts and a kind of quite a static image of Bhaktivinoda. People kept turning back to the same texts, and they happened to be early texts a lot of the time. So something like his Bhagavat speech, which he writes in 1869, and really is kind of like his first public break, publicly aligning himself with the Gaudiya, with the cause of Mahaprabhu. That had really served what I felt kind of a quite inordinate role in the context of Bhaktivinoda, in scholarship on Bhaktivinoda Thakur, to take something that someone had written right at the beginning of their Vaishnav conversion, so to speak, and use that to characterize them as a whole.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Yeah. Sorry, am I being, please, like if
I get what you're saying. No, I get what you're saying. Yeah. So you're saying that modern devotees have only looked at Bhaktivinoda Thakur's early kind of works and have kind of given him like a very static view, like they kind of expressed him as being very static because they haven't really seen the full breadth of his evolution. You could say.
Yeah, exactly. Although I'm talking more about scholars. So a
Scholars.
lot of these people aren't actually devotees who are right. Since Shukabak is
I see.
But there are others who have taken interest in Bhaktivinoda Thakura since Shukabak that aren't, well, at least externally aren't devotees. Although very lovely people, I have to say as well.
Right.
That they had done that. I think as well that kind of and also the other thing that I noticed is that the way that Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakura was treated overall was with a real emphasis on the sort of modernizing, westernizing in a sense. That he in scholarship, in the existing body of scholarship on Bhaktivinoda Thakura, he comes to be seen as really marking a break within the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition. A break that itself instantiates the effect of colonialism and colonial modernity. You have to think that Bengalis in Calcutta was the hub of empire, hub of empire, and lots of cultural, interactions, but it also becomes the, kind of Bengalis, or like the Bengali intelligentsia, educated Bengalis really are kind of the first group in Asia to be, to have their minds transformed by the encounter with Western modes of thinking. And, so Bhaktivinoda Thakura in scholarship came to be seen as, or represented as, instantiating colonialism's rupture within Hinduism more broadly, Gaudiya Vaishnavism more specifically. So you have terms like neo-Vaishnav, which doesn't just mean historically more recent, but also means that neo, that prefix neo, indicates also a kind of, there's something structurally different here. Something's happened, interestingly as well, it's talking about going back to what goes on in devotional circles. The scholarship on Bhaktivinoda Thakura, I think, is also implicitly fed off internal narratives about, institutional narratives about Bhaktivinoda Thakura that read him completely in isolation from anything else that's going on in the Vaishnav scene in 19th century Bengal. There's more or less a narrative that, like, it just, it's a Vaishnav vacuum. There's only, like Sahajiyas and, fallen people, and, there's no inch, but, no doubt Sahajiyas are there, and some of those observations are what I came to see was that there's a rich Vaishnav world in that context, and a lot of Vaishnav activity. But I think scholarship, academic scholarship, it kind of fed off these insider narratives, institutional narratives that sort of present Bhaktivinoda Thakura as like this lone ranger almost.
Yeah, that's how I
in the darkness of, there's like nothing going on. So those two things have maybe inadvertently, or the scholarship has inadvertently fed off those things, and has led to this notion of rupture, a kind of rupture within the Gaudiya Vaishnava world, rupture, like radical discontinuity, So my work ended up being trying to problematize that narrative. I felt that it didn't quite fit. Certain things didn't fit really, in terms of what I was encountering. Where I found, and this again, this ties in with the whole notion of his, the great variety of his thought, and the sort of trajectory that Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakura undergoes, and that I saw that as, I wanted to read that in relation to what was going on the ground in terms of his devotional life, so I sort of paid attention to the transitions in Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakura's works, and reading them in relation to what I called his micro context, or his devotional life world.
Right.
So, yeah,
I want to ask you a little bit about, because I remember I asked you before when we were just talking, I said, Bhaktivinoda Thakur being a Nitya Siddha, as we are taught, that how can he have, I mean, this was a clickbait kind of title that we put, like the transformation of Bhaktivinoda Thakur. Actually, so how do you explain someone who's a Nitya Siddha, but who has this kind of like transformation? Like, I heard in his biography, he writes about that he used to eat meat and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. In his Shalakita Jibani,
right. No one really talks about that biography. Like that's the first time I ever heard it, because someone knew that you're going to do this interview, and they said, "Have you ever heard of this biography?" And I was like, "No, I never heard of it." Like, and they say different things. So let's talk a little bit about that.
So with Bhaktivinoda Thakur, you have this amazing, like, I mean, I think it's very novel in a sense, in that it's really perhaps one of the first Gaudiya figures. I mean, like if you're talking about Srila Rupa Goswami, for instance, or those of the past, of the the 16th, the 17th centuries. There are the biographies, such as all the Prem Bilas and Narottam Bilas and all these. But like, to get sort of real insight into what was going on in their lives. I mean, we have their texts, but they don't leave autobiographies as such. Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur left a fairly substantial autobiography, detailing many of the things in his life up until 1896. I mean, I think that must be a first for a Gaudiya, Gaudiya figure, to have that much insight into what they were doing on the ground, so to speak. That text, Shalakita Jibani, which was written in the form of a letter to his 10th son and disciple, Lalit Prasad. That was published in I think it was first published in 1916, but it doesn't really gain prominence in the context of the Gaudiya Mat, and the institutional. I mean, I think some of the scholars writing on Bhaktivinoda Thakur, like Sundarananda Vidya-Vinod, undoubtedly drew on that text. There's no way that text didn't inform the institutional biographies of Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur coming from the Gaudiya Mat, and which obviously have then shaped the way that ISKCON, things like the 7th Goswami, for instance.
Right. And you're saying biography as in like institutional biography, as in like actual written biographies?
Yeah, exactly, about Bhaktivinoda Thakur.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. So that Shalakita Jibani, it doesn't feature so much, it doesn't come to prominence either in the Gaudiya Mat and by extension then ISKCON. I think because of it really draws it, I mean, Bhaktivinoda Thakur is drawing attention to is revealing the very kind of, quote unquote, human dimensions of his life. He's not presenting himself as like a self-realized person, but then again, he doesn't do that in his devotional poetry either. It's
That's right.
There is also autobiography in his. I don't think his songs are just tropes, for the purpose of like, the neophytes. I think they're also sincere expressions of Bhaktivinoda Thakur's heart. I read them in that way, at least, and that aligns with the way, in a more prosaic form, he's writing about his life in the context of his autobiography. But things like, as you just drew attention to, his eating of meat. He's born in a Shakta family. His maternal grandfather was a prominent Shakta zamindar in the context of his village, Bir Nagar or Ula. He, in his youth, first of all, he experienced just an inconceivable amount of tragedy. The village in which he grew up, it was hit by waves of, repeated waves of the cholera epidemic, where like many members of his family died. His father had died by the time he was around 11, 12, 13, so he was like really like the man of the household by the time he was then he was sent to Calcutta to go to school, the great Hindu college in Calcutta, where he's schmoozing with many of the sort of rising stars of the day, people like Keshav Chandra Sen and the Tagore family, and then associates with Christians and Brahmos, and maybe a lot of some of these things people know, I'm sure. But you know, he talks about, yeah, like, you know, his meat, he reveals in his autobiography that he doesn't, at least he writes, he doesn't, you know, it was at the time of my initiation that I gave up the sin of eating meat or eating goat. You know, that's like a, you know, when we, you know, if we have a very sort of stereotyped notion of what a quote unquote nitya siddha is, right, that's like, you know, they're very difficult to process those sorts of things, you know. So as a result, maybe for the, I don't know, this simple-hearted, or, you know, that was sort of marginalized. That text was marginalized. I think actually, you know, maybe sort of regrettably, really, because you know, I mean, are we not able to, do we not have the resources to accommodate that theologically? You know, that, you know, that someone can both be a nitya siddha and, you know, have I mean, for instance, Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita. No, there's the whole experience of confusion and bewilderment. Yeah. Mahaprabhu himself undergoes a trajectory, you know, from a somewhat sort of audacious scholar in his youth to an intense Krishna bhakta later. Even, you know, even in God himself, right? You know, there's a trajectory, that, you know, there's a transition, you know. So in the context of Bhaktivinoda Thakura, I mean, there's an evident transition. You know, my thesis is in no way seeking to, you know, challenge, you know, is Bhaktivinoda Thakura a nitya siddha? I mean, that's I kind of almost, I mean, in the context of scholarship, I don't think there's any way you can challenge it or disprove it. That's like, that's not really a question for the domain of scholarship. Right. It's the empirical domain. You know, we do a certain kind of work which can be interesting and inform, you know, kind of an interesting thing for faith to engage with, but it doesn't determine faith. You know, I mean, no, you know, no, it's like, it's not a necessary thing for faith at all. But some people have the predisposition to do kind of more intellectual work, right? And so, you know, so I bracket that in the context of my thesis, whether he's that question, it just doesn't fit. Is he a nitya siddha or not? I have my own faith position on that. You know, I think, you know, I think what it does potentially do, it might provoke, and not that this is even intentional, but like, you know, a kind of two-dimensional understanding of what a sort of cardboard cutout of a, you know, a devotee that falls from the spiritual world, you know, falls or descends from the spiritual world, you know, and floats above, you know, the untainted by the material domain, etc. You know, I mean, when we read his autobiography, we get a real sense of like someone who was, you know, struggling with work. I mean, he was. I think actually it's to witness what's going on in Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakura's life, you know, to see these things that he was contending with death, with illness, with like being moved around in his employment posts, you know, interminably, just kind of like non-stop, kind of, you know, with all, and 14 children he had, you know, 14 kids and all of it. I mean, can you imagine 14 kids? I know, you know, you got two, I know, I got one, and it's you know, 14 children, working as you know, climbing his way up, you know, the Indian civil, you know, in the Indian civil service, in the post of eventually deputy magistrate, kind of like a law officer, you know, a judge kind, and also revenue collector, you know, all these sorts of things in places like, you know, in Orissa and Bengal, you know, to see all of that, right? To see all of that, and then to you know, and his background and his shaktis, and then to see what he ended up doing. I mean, that makes it all the more miraculous. You know what I mean? You know, yes. I don't think in any way that takes anything away from, you know, that he was eating meat. So, you know, like I don't know. I don't have a problem accommodating that, at least.
Right. You know? Yeah, me neither. But it's interesting, and it's interesting to hear the history. And I really like the point you made about how it's good to see how the evolution happened. You know, it's and something I want to kind of hone in on is that you were saying that the common narrative is that, from what I've always heard, that he was this lone ranger, you know?
Yeah.
So what about that is important to mention in regarding like who he was associating with at the time?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's a whole, so at the Center for Hindu Studies, we've begun we've been doing for many years now a project on Bengali Vaishnavism in the modern period, Gaudiya Vaishnavism in the context of modernity, and brought together a whole team of scholars who've been working in this area in some capacity. And they've highlighted an array, just as one example, in terms of like Vaishnav journalism, so putting out periodicals, so we know about the Shajantoshini, that was Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur's thing. But in addition to that, there was, I think, from about the late 19th century to the early 20th century, there's about 300 plus Vaishnav periodicals, running for some amount of time, some longer than others. That's just some indication of like intense intellectual activity going on in the 19th century and early 20th century in Bengal. There are a lot of people either turning to Vaishnavism or have already been Vaishnav and are engaging in that kind of work. It becomes like Vaishnavism really becomes a thing that like Bengalis turn to at a certain point for various reasons. It also has, as a scholar called Varuni Bhatia has called particular attention to, has a lot to do with a growing current of cultural nationalism, this regional identity, what it means to be Bengal in the context of colonialism and colonial subjugation, and an emerging nation, these sorts of things. So Mahaprabhu, Caitanya, Dev, and Vaishnav culture, they're turning to it for that. So there's a lot of scholarly activity, but there are also Vaishnavs, of a more religious persuasion, like Bhaktivinoda Thakur, and many of the people that he was working with and associating with. Not least, there are also in that context pre-existing Vaishnav currents. Goswami, Shripats. We hear it sounds about the caste Goswamis. They're but like we see in that context, they also play a prominent role, and Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur and others among is working with certain groups among them. And so we know he takes initiation into the Bhagnapada Sampradaya that descends from Bangshi Badanananda Thakur, through Ramai Goswami, through Janavamata, Ramachandra Goswami, all the way down to Bipin Bihari Goswami. And,
right, that was his Diksha guru.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly, his Diksha guru. That's another thing that's sometimes, kind of like that's written out of the,
Right.
This is admittedly a controversial subject, and I'm aware.
We don't deal with controversy on the show.
He takes initiation from Bipin Bihari Goswami around 1879, 1880, around I think 1870. I don't know. Sometimes I get the Bangla and the Christian years a bit mixed up, but around that time, and some narratives that get told, oh, this is just a formality, a relationship of convenience. Look at Keshav, Keshav Bharati and Mahaprabhu, these sorts of things, just a pure formality. But we know that, we turn to the textual evidence, and we see not only does Bhaktivinoda Thakur himself in his own texts, beginning from Kalyana Kalpataru, where he's invoking in the Mangalacharan, in that, and then the Bengali translate, but the Sanskrit and the Bengali references to Bipin Bihari Goswami. Again, we see it in his Gita Mala, references to Bipin Bihari Goswami in his, his Swarup identity, in his Chaitanya Charitamrita, Amrita Prabha Bhashya. We see it there too. We see it again in Bhagavatarka Marichi Mala. This is at the end of it. So he features all the way across his, not maybe all the way to the end, but for us, for a good number of decades, he's featuring within Bhaktivinoda Thakur's devotional world. This, of course, we don't hear about any of this in the context of, we hear about Srila Jagannath Das Babaji Maharaj.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like on the altar, the pictures are, okay, it's Bhaktivinoda Thakur, then Jagannath Das Babaji, but there's something going on between them in the sense of like other people.
Yeah, there's exactly. So he meets Srila Jagannath Das Babaji Maharaj just a little bit after he meets Bipin Bihari Goswami, and he certainly forms a disciplic relation, disciple, shiksha type relationship with Jagannath Das Babaji Maharaj. And interestingly, so this isn't just a Gaudiya Mutt stroke ISKCON thing. By Gaudiya Mutt, I mean, it's Saraswati, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur's institution, those things that grow from it.
Yes.
But actually, we also see in a biography written by Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakura's personal servant who served him in the last approximately 7 years of his life, someone called Krishnadas Babaji, served Srila Bhaktivinoda and actually passes away himself a year after Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakura passes away. So, I mean, what was going on?
Hold on a second. So this is his personal servant of how many years?
About 7 years or so, something like. I mean, yeah.
I've never heard of him.
I believe there's like a murti of him in is it in Godruma Dweep possibly? Okay. Where there's I think so. There's yeah, if I recall correctly. But he writes his own Bhaktivinoda Charit. He's got nothing to do with the I mean the Gaudiya Mutt hadn't been founded by that point.
Right.
But in this text, Bhaktivinoda Charit, interestingly, there's like the only mention of Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur's guru in that text is with reference to Srila Jagannath Das Babaji Maharaj. So even there, we start to see the occlusion of Bipin Bihari Goswami. So I'm not saying there's nothing to those narratives in the Gaudiya, in the Gaudiya Mutt.
Right.
Something happened in their relationship, whether it was during the time of Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur's living presence or it was posthumously after his departure. Something went on in that domain where the relationship became complicated, so to speak. There's a book by Bipin Bihari Goswami's great-grandson or grandson, I forget what it is. I think it's his great-grandson, it must be, I believe, called Kanam Bihari Goswami. He's a scholar at Calcutta University. He writes an impressive text on the Bhagnapada Sampradaya, the tradition associated with Janavamatta and Ramachandra Goswami and Bipin Bihari Goswami. He writes in there that that Bhaktivinoda Thakur was rejected by Bipin Bihari Goswami for preaching untruths associated with Mayapur. Associated with Mayapur. But the interesting thing, of course, is that Bipin Bihari Goswami was a prominent member of the Navadip Dham Pracharani Sabha, the organization set up to promote the establishment of Mayapur, and went round collecting on behalf of it. So he fully approved of Mayapur up until a certain point. The issue of Mayapur, of course, and this is another, if we can sort of segue into that briefly, that was a very contentious issue. Naturally, if you think about what's going on there, there's like, the existing town of Navadip in the late 19th century, and they have their temples, etc. in there. And then Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur comes along and has his vision, and then does his research. Across the water, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. There's a Muslim fishing village at the time, right? There's, but there's lots of Tulsi, etc. But has his vision and then supports it with, research, based on whatever. And comes in and says, no, this is the actual birthplace of Mahaprabhu, but we go Jai, right? But to think about historically, I mean, what kind of controversy is that going to cause in the context of Navadip with the existing Goswami communities there,
who are followers of Lord Caitanya, and they're saying it's right here in our backyard.
Yeah. Or they at the time were saying we don't know where it is. It's kind of it's like it's lost. It's been swallowed by the Ganga. But these are certain. Then Bhaktivinoda Thakur comes along and essentially. So that's why scholars have come along and said, well, Bhaktivinoda Thakur represents a rupture within the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition. What essentially he was doing was.
Fascinating.
Appropriating, arrogating unto himself the power to represent the tradition, taking it away from the traditional purveyors of Vaishnava authority, the Goswamis, etc. And establishing Mayapur, and this then becomes like, a Vaishnavism for the Bengali middle classes, and and those, and eventually, even Westerners, right? But it's like, and the reason that we can identify with Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur's brand of Vaishnavism is because, in a sense, we're seeing a mirror of ourselves. It's been deeply shaped by Western modernity. It's been deeply shaped by those modes. So when we see things in Bhaktivinoda Thakur that we identify, that's, these scholars would be saying, that's because it's actually, it's a ruptured Vaishnavism. It's shaped by the forces of colonialism, etc., and post-Enlightenment modes of thinking. So that's what Bhaktivinoda Thakur, that is embodied then in his Mayapur campaign. And it is, of course, for a devotee, and to say, that's what, it's like, like that doesn't sit that well. That doesn't really sit very, just intuitively, there's a lot more going on to it than that. Before we get there, though, interestingly, though, in relation to this particular Mayapur thing and the Goswamis, Bhaktivinoda Thakur was working with a number of Goswamis. That this was not just a kind of, westernized intellectual versus traditional elite kind of,
right, like him versus everyone else.
The existing, he was working with the traditional literati as well. There were a number of Goswamis, not least his own guru, that was supporting his campaign. Bipin Bihari Goswami was supporting his campaign. Of course, we know that Srila Jagannath Das Babaji Maharaj, when Bhaktivinoda Thakur, sort of discerned the spot, he danced for joy, we're told.
He was like in a basket and started jumping.
Exactly. But it wasn't. He wasn't an isolated figure. There were a number of. It was a real mix. It's a very nuanced thing that what was going on there. There was a, sorry, I don't know what the. Anyways, I forget what the main point was.
Mayapur was the point, and the rupture in the.
Yeah, exactly. Then.
That's really fascinating. So why is that important to note, that this was a kind of like I say, a rupture in the Vaishnava community? Why do you think that's important to note as like for us?
Sorry. Okay. So it's important to know, but I remember now why I was bringing that up.
Yeah, go for it.
Actually, so there was the establishment of Mayapur. This is all in relation to the issue of Bhaktivinoda Thakur's relationship with his Diksha guru.
Right. Yeah.
The fact is that they were working closely together for a long period of time, up until at least the early 20th century. So that's a period of over nearly 30 years. Working closely together. The issue of Mayapur, however, Bhaktivinoda Thakur's finding of Mayapur, establishment of Mayapur, and it doesn't settle the problem, it persists. And so again, in like 1915 or 16 or something like that, it's, where there's a devotee called Braj Mohan Das that does new research and says, no, this is not it. It's over there. It's over there in Ramachandrapur. This is so. Today we have Prachin Mayapur. It's sort of mirroring almost. It's like two, exact birth spots of Mahaprabhu in the Navadvip region. One Prachin Mayapur, one Mayapur as we know it. So that then causes, that gains momentum, and I think as a result of that, peer pressure or whatever, but. Maybe Bipin Bihari Goswami around that time finds himself, rejecting his disciples' version of events or account of where Mayapur is, and finds himself, having to align himself with, with now what is the new dominant narrative in the context of the Gaudiya world of that time, So, and maybe as a result of that, distancing himself from Bhaktivinoda Thakur at that point.
So he rejected him because he had to disagree with his idea of where Mayapur was. I mean, where the birthplace was.
Yeah, maybe that's my speculation. There's apparently an article by Bipin Bihari Goswami written under another name, where he says this explicitly. I've never been able to find that article, and I looked for a long time in the British Library, throughout archives in Bengal. I looked everywhere for it, and came close, but never actually found the exact thing, but that's the claim. Yeah, that Bipin Bihari Goswami distanced himself from Bhaktivinoda Thakur as a result of the Mayapur controversy. But the fact remains, though, that he supported and worked closely with Bhaktivinoda Thakur for a long period of time. And we also know that Saraswati Thakur was himself involved in editing some of the works of Bipin Bihari Goswami. So in the introduction to Bipin Bihari Goswami writes a text called the Hari Bhakti Tarangini, published in 1902, all about essentially what is Vaishnav Sadachar and things like deity worship, etc. That text, Saraswati Thakur is noted in there as, in the introduction, as having edited the work. It was published from Bhakti Bhavan, Bhaktivinoda Thakur's press, that text also ends up being advertised in the Gaudiya, Mutt's periodical, the Gaudiya. So there are intimate. It's funny what's happened. There would, what I've discovered is that there are interesting connections. If we look to the sources, we find that have been somewhat silenced or occluded over time. But yeah, so some people come across this stuff, and they, and they go, okay, yeah, they go, okay, well,
it's also like overwhelming. A little.
Are you regretting having me on your show?
No, I don't regret it. I think it's fascinating. It's I think we're gonna get to the comment section a bit. I haven't looked at it, but I see some questions and things. But we're gonna get to that. So if you're listening to this and you have a question that you want to ask Lalita Madhava Prabhu, put it in the comments and I'm going to go through them. But what I want to kind of go into now is about, so you finished your thesis on it. So what was your experience like in writing that thesis? Like, did you have to really focus on the exact kind of thesis statement that you were, or did you find so many things? Like, we're discussing it and we're finding so many directions to go in. So how did you kind of like focus? I feel like
I mean the first question that my supervisor asked me in our first meeting at Oxford was, so what's your argument? Right. And I was, what? Excuse me? Like, I have no idea. But essentially the next at least 3 years or so was somewhat a torturous kind of like journey trying to work out exactly what. I mean, I didn't really have anything to say yet because I need to read the material first. How it really began. This is to go back a bit, and we can return to Shukovak's book, who was did that first major piece of scholarship on Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur. He had turned to a text called the Krishna Samhita, which was published just around the time that Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur received initiation from Bipin Bihari Goswami in 1879. The first edition of that was published then, at least. And Shukovak had used that text to characterize what Bhaktivinoda Thakur is doing in his theology, or what he represents. And so just to summarize that in brief. Sorry, this is a roundabout way to address your question, but I will get to
that's okay. This is cool.
Shukovak essentially argues in the Krishna Samhita, it's a very radical text for any devote. Have you ever No. It's a very interesting text in that it's written in 3 parts: the Upakramanika, the introduction, the Samhita portion, and the Upashanghar, the conclusion. The Samhita portion is essentially, Bhaktivinoda Thakur says he's writing it in the in the traditional method, writing it in sort of shloka form and detailing essentially a theology of the Leela of Krishna. And the Shaktis and that's also the first place we see, what the various demons represent in Krishna Leela, etc.
Right. Oh, yes.
But the section that's somewhat bewildering when you first encounter it is the Upakramanika, the introduction. In that Bhaktivinoda Thakur there is essentially, so when we read our scriptures, right, we are presented with a particular version of how history is. You know what I mean? There's, you know, and it's millions and millions, and I mean, it's infinite, it's eternal essentially. But you know, we're dealing with like these temporal, you know, expanses that are just unimaginable, and you know, and these, you know, I don't know, so many events happening in this yuga and that yuga, etc. And also scriptures appearing at certain points in time, you know. So Bhagavatam at the onset of Kali Yuga, 5,000 years ago, roughly, as we understand it. What Bhaktivinoda Thakura is doing in that text, in the introduction of the text, he's like revising the history of essentially Indian religion, or you know, Hindu religion in the context, or Vaishnava religion in the context of India, and he's doing it in accordance with the findings of modern philological research, textual scholarship, you know. So he's so things like you know, he's revising, you know, what the yugas are and kind of making them seem a little bit more, you know, rationally acceptable.
Oh,
you know,
dang.
he's also, you know, revising when certain texts appear. He goes so far as to posit the notion that the Bhagavatam itself was not written by Veda Vyas, but someone with the pen name, using the pen name of Vyas in South India 1,000 years ago. It's like, whoa. No, he's suggesting that. So what he's saying is, but how Shukavak reads him in this text, what he's doing is that what Bhaktivinoda Thakura is showing here is that we can apply reason to those aspects of our tradition that are, you know, the legitimate domain of rational scrutiny. So the phenomenal realm, the realm where you can apply reason, geography, history, etc., etc., etc. You know, but none of that affects affects the transcendent or prakrita nature of Sri Krishna, of Bhagavan. It doesn't matter when the Bhagavatam appeared. You know, I mean, if it contains truth, it's irrelevant. You know, right. I mean, the eternality of the Bhagavat is still it still holds, even if it appeared just 1,000 years ago, or whatever, by someone using the pen name Vyas, for example. So he's doing that there. So in that way, drawing a line between like the realm of the phenomenal, you know, that's susceptible to the application of rational analysis, and then the noumenal domain, which is, you know, which is untainted and remains pure and eternal. You know,
what's the reason that he's trying to make it more rational?
Well, he says that Bhaktivinoda Thakura, he's because as Shukavak reads him, he's writing for the Western educated audiences, the Bengali intelligentsia, and also ideally those beyond Bengal in the West. You know, and this will allow them to at least begin engaging with the tradition. You know, rather than having to deal with, you know, Puranic history is quite fantastical. You know, I mean, it has an orientation to it.
Lord Vishnu and the
lotus
and Brahma, four heads, and the whole thing.
So Bhaktivinoda Thakura is doing that in the Krishna Samhita, and then Shukavak, he says, well, this. He then uses that text to really characterize Bhaktivinoda Thakura, and that's what I was talking about, allowing me, when I read that for the first time, to survive in academia. I thought, cool, this gives me a framework with which I can subject, you know, engage in sort of rational analysis, but at the same time retain my faith in the eternality of the blue, you know, the dark-hued cowherd lord, you know, and his entourage.
So within that point, because that's really interesting, because I know we talked about this a little bit earlier, but His Holiness Padmanabh Swami came on 1 or 2 episodes back, and we were talking about, is bhakti inherent in the jiva, that whole philosophical controversy. And so one of his points was, and I don't want to misrepresent it, but from what I understood, he was saying that Bhaktivinoda Thakur said certain things for what we call as preaching strategy. It's kind of like, is that similar to what you're saying?
No, well, that's similar to what Shukavak is saying. Oh, no, sorry. Well, sorry, this is actually, it's not similar to what Shukavak is saying. Shukavak, this is, yeah, okay, so that's a common thing that people say. Bhaktivinoda was doing, no doubt there was preaching strategies going on, right? But back to what Shukavak's saying about Bhaktivinoda Thakur, about, you know, representing what he's doing in the Krishna Samhita like that. But when I turned to the Krishna Samhita and I read it, I didn't read it in that way. You know, it was and interestingly, we have the benefit in Oxford of having, he had sent to Oxford the first edition of the Krishna Samhita, you know, signed by Bhaktivinoda Thakura. It is, and so I was like, whoa, this is something that I did. Yeah.
Like,
So,
he actually signed it.
yeah, I signed it. There's like a, you know, a picture of him in there. It's like cool, and there's a letter,
Amazing.
giving it to Monier Williams, who was the great Sanskrit professor here at the time. But when I read the Krishna Samhita, I found actually, although the narrative sounds quite persuasive, that Shukavat, his interpretation of the text, that he's, you know, when I read it, and this interpretation has been very influential in scholarship, I also have to add. Essentially, what Shukavat did there has shaped the way that people have read Bhaktivinoda Thakura in scholarship since he's done it. You know, that his reading has been definitive. So I thought I should start by addressing that. You know, let's see if it holds. Turn to the text, and I saw actually this is quite complicated. First and foremost, you know, it's like even in the first edition of the text, there are like multiple concerns here. He's definitely not just writing for a Bhadralok audience, you know, like for there's, you know.
Bhadralok, what do you mean again?
Oh, sorry, I hadn't explained that. The Western educated Bengalis.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because Lalita Madhava Prabhu, for our listeners, sent me some of his writings, and I was like, he's like, you know, I was like, send me some of your stuff, and I was like, I'll read up on it to prepare for this interview, and I read it, and I was like, like I read that word Bhadralok, yeah.
Oh yeah. So that definitely features there.
Sorry to interject with my
yeah. No, but, well, I mean, literally, it means gentleman, or, you know, the Bhadra, the cultured person.
Right.
But it became like a self-designation by those who were like, you know, Bhadralok, as opposed to the lesser people, the Chotalok, you know, right. the less cultured people, you know. Right. But and has been has been absorbed into scholarship in this area, somewhat problematically, perhaps. Sorry, too many details there. But you brought it up.
Yes.
That he wasn't just doing that. It was like there were definitely there seemed to be actually he's trying to straddle multiple worlds in the text. You know, because if you think about it at the time, it was just before getting initiated into a very traditional Goswami lineage that he published the text. So he was not, and he had been consulting with his guru, we learn, for 3 years prior to his initiation, you know, back and forth, letters back and forth. So, you know, he's obviously also writing for pre-existing, he's not just, you know, for the westernized Bengalis, but he's also writing with existing Vaishnav communities in mind. You know, what are they going to think of this text? Are they going to, is it going to be, and of course, on that note, to bear in mind that those sorts of recognitions were important to Bhaktivinoda Thakura. The name Bhaktivinoda, you know, one who pleases bhakti, that is bestowed upon him in 1886 by the Bhagnapada Goswamis, by Bipin Bihari Goswami's lineage, you know, and his community. They give him that name Bhaktivinoda, which he uses for the rest of his life, you know, to bear in mind. So he's obviously writing with these sorts of figures in mind as well. And interestingly, then I turned to what I learned was actually no one had mentioned this. Everyone had just been dealing with the Krishna Samhita as if it was just like only published once. It was published twice, at least. Yeah, there were two editions. It was published a number of times, but there were two editions of the text. One in 1879 and one in 1903, around that time, 1903. It was a second edition. Mm-hmm. And in that edition of the text, there are these subtle, I came across, I was reading both editions side by side, and I went, wait a second, this isn't quite the same as what it says there. You know, there's like, whereas in the first edition, he was going, well, you know, I can suggest, we speculate that, you know, that Vedavyas, you know, didn't write the Bhagavat, 5,000 years ago, but someone using the pen name Vyas 1,000 years ago in South India. In the second edition of the text, he says, modern scholars, now he's distancing himself from that narrative. Right. Modern scholars speculate that the Bhagavat was written only 1,000 years ago by someone using the pen name Vyas, right? Only 1,000 years ago in South India. Then, you know, in the footnote, we, however, totally disagree with this opinion. This position cannot be considered faith. We believe only the verdict of the Shastra. You know, so this is, so that's where I go, wow, That's very interesting. I found that transition very interesting, to go from, entertaining ideas potentially, whether it's a preaching strategy or, I perhaps, based on other things that I've read of Bhaktivinoda Thakura, he's actually open to those things, to those revised views. 25 years later, saying, no, having been fully exposed to these, to philology, to modern research, saying, no, we believe only the verdict of the Shastra. You know what I mean? So he knows what scholars say, knows how they do their, he's acquainted with their methodologies, but in the face of that, he's saying, no, but I only believe the scholarly, the traditional account, the verdict of Shastra. I felt that was indicative to me of like, there's a transition that's taken place there, and also the importance of, as opposed to what Shukavak is saying, with regard to, elements of the Shastra, some are phenomenal and can be revised, some are eternal and must be preserved. Actually, what Bhaktivinoda Thakura seems to be implying by what he's doing in that text is, no, the integrity of the entirety of the Bhagavat's narrative is important, and we embrace it in its totality. We embrace all of it, How does he do that? Actually, how does he do that? Having been fully exposed to critical history, And I thought, well, there's something going on here than just Bhaktivinoda Thakur being, as Shukavak paints him, a kind of modern liberal theologian, that essentially, sort of compromises with the world. Essentially, it's, it's like there's a different, there's so on the first view, on Shukavak's reading, how the Bhagavat looks to Bhaktivinoda, essentially, is that there's like the eternal core of Krishna, but then all the narratives, about the history, the endings, they're just there just to kind of, they're just an external casing, and maybe for like, the simple-minded, for example, like that. But on this view, Bhakti is saying that the entirety of the thing is important, the entirety of the thing, but how does he do that? Because he's also very aware of like, critical history. And I felt that transition was an interesting one to explore, and that kind of sort of gave me the direction in which I was going to hone my argument.
Wow.
Tracing these transitions in Bhaktivinoda, and then I found it in other domains too. I found it in the context of his polemics against the Sahajiyas.
Right.
Which is a key feature of his work, and I also found it in his what we know as his universalism. His accommodating of other faiths and other traditions, and ascribing
the Church of Kirtan and things.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I found transitions in his writings over time in those other domains too. And
wow.
So the picture comes like, to be how we paint Bhaktivinoda, to text in isolation and just, use that, to represent the entirety of Bhaktivinoda Thakur's thought is, I think, a bit distorting and misleading. We have to be aware of the entirety a little bit.
Right.
I think that was
wow. There's so much you can say about this. It's like an amazing, fascinating topic. But let's go into the questions. A lot of discussion happening in the comment section. From what I see here. Let's start here. How did you harmonize the academic need to be rigorously objective and critical of your sources versus the devotional urge to accept things on faith and love, even when you don't fully comprehend them? Interesting question.
Yeah, that's a very interesting, very pertinent, and it's an ongoing dynamic, I would say. It's, have I harmonized? I don't, sometimes I feel I do better than others, but I've always been one to not shy away from challenging my own faith. From the out. Essentially, I've been in academia almost as long as I've taken spiritual life, somewhat seriously. So they sat side by side really from the outset, and at times it is, I found ways to harmonize it. At other times I've been challenged and found it. Like being a little bit bewildered and lost. But it's an ongoing thing. It's I really like a French philosopher called Paul Ricoeur, who deals with interpretation, hermeneutics, interpretation as a really central to our way of being. And he has the notion of the hermeneutic arc, in which, at least particularly in the context of modernity, this modern moment, that we begin, that there's, a primary kind of just naive acceptance of, religious symbols and narratives and that domain, and then in the context of modernity, and if we're engaging in, the world of criticism, all of that gets called into question. It's like it's being put through that, that can serve a role too. He says, that it allows like idols to, sorry, I'm getting a bit too abstract here. I was going to say idols to die, so that's, but anyways, I won't go there. But the key concept I wanted to draw on was this notion of a second naivete, that it's like, and the danger is you get into academia, you get, like there are many people who start off as practitioners, devotees, whatever, whether if, in the Gaudiya tradition or other things, and they begin and by the end they're like, just another dry academic, I mean, some really do survive and thrive and do really well. I can name many, but also there's also the risk of, of going another direction. But as Paul Ricoeur says, after the desert of criticism, we wish to be called again, and to find a second naivete, so much of my really existence within academia and outside of it for the past decade is like being, while I'm doing this work, trying to find my second naivete, because I also, I believe, and actually to address Caroline's question directly, in the context of the mission to which I'm broadly associated, this notion of Sharanagati, surrender. There's a book that Srila Sridhar Maharaj wrote called Prapanajivanamritam, all about Sharanagati and the various a compilation of verses that really highlight, the various dimensions of surrender in a systematic way. But and how important that so ultimately there's like my scholarship. It's like I don't want to be, I think at like the time of my death. I don't want to see my academic articles. Do you know what I mean? This is something I'm doing now, and it can be useful for a particular phase of existence that I'm in, and I have certain kinds of dispositions, and and it actually has its challenge, but in some ways deepened my faith in certain moments. Wow. But ultimately, I believe very much in like, at the end of the day, Sharanagati, aspiration, not that I'm there at all, but that's and the chastity to my own spiritual mind, that like ultimately, I think sometimes I'm going to bring my thesis to Bhaktivinoda Thakura, and I write thesis, like give me a break, give me, or even to my own Gurudev, I'll be a bit very shy. I don't, a bit shy, like maybe some of my god brothers and god sisters I can share it with, I like that, and but I,
it's beautiful hearing that from you, because it's not something that we hear from scholars, like kind of their internal, like what they're thinking about when such a question arises, so this is what I feel the beauty of the show is, that we can bring that out from people when we don't really hear things like that. Thank you for answering that. We have a few more questions, so I'm going to stop you there, and we'll look at some other ones. Here's a interesting one. It is my impression that Bhaktivinoda Thakura was more liberal in his views regarding religion than his son or Prabhupada. Can you comment on that? Also, did Bhaktivinoda Thakura believe that Lord Chaitanya was Krishna himself? Thank you.
Okay. Well, I'll begin with the first part of that question first, which is very simple, and I think just a resolute yes. Bhaktivinoda Thakura did believe that Lord Chaitanya was Krishna himself, without a doubt. Although he writes a book at the end, towards the later on in his life, that is part of the English language. Is it Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, his life and precepts?
Yes.
That accompanies his Sri Gauranga Smarana Leela Smarana Mangala Stotram and the Sanskrit, and in there, he's writing, but he's also saying, I believe that, that Lord Chaitanya is Bhagavan, the Lord himself. But even if you don't, if you can accept him as a holy person, something a lot, I'm paraphrasing, so also in that sense, that that you'll gain some benefit anyways, you know, I mean, just by engaging with this material. In terms of the first part of that question, I would say that that's kind of what so there's this stereotype of this cliche of like, you know, like Bhaktivinoda Thakura, the liberal, Saraswati Thakura, the conservative. I mean, I think there's both deeply liberal aspects to what Saraswati Thakura is doing, and very conservative aspects in Bhaktivinoda Thakura too, particularly in his later writing. For instance, we take his Bhagavat speech that he gives at the outset of his quote-unquote Vaishnav sojourn, or when it says that, you know, those truths of theology and philosophy are like the peaks of great towering mountains, you know, and the great personalities, thinkers, you know, and religious figures of history have looked towards those same peaks, but they've taken their, you know, positions at, you know, different places in the world, some east, some west, some further east, some further west, you know, but all are looking to the same mountain in a sense, you know. And great liberalism, accommodating, you know, all of that, you know, and Shukavak in his book quotes that speech in every chapter of his, you know, at the outset of the epigraph of every chapter of his book. But then we look at the Swaniyama Dwadashikam of Bhaktivinoda Thakura, the last piece that he writes in his own writing, and he says, you know, towards the end of that, I forget what it's, verse 9 or 8 or something, he says, and those, you know, pious people who worship Krishna but don't pay attention to Srimati Radhika, yes, I cannot even be in the same place as them. That is audacity. That is, you know, that is pride, like that, you know, the intensity of that, you know. But I mean, Mahaprabhu himself, you know, has both deeply universal and also very particularist, specific. In the last 12 years of his life, you know, in the Gambhir, you know, like, you know, the intense, you know, and, you know, poetry and writings being vetted by Swarup Damodar before Mahaprabhu would look at them, because he couldn't handle anything that had any element of rasa bhas in it, for instance, you know. But is that, so that's like super specific, a very particular, very, you know, like, you know, cultivating a very particular mood. But is that conservative, or is that also in some paradoxical way actually deeply liberal if we think about what he's cultivating? You know, Krishna as like the very specific Lord, the charming medium-sized Lord, as opposed to, you know, Bhagavat, you know, Brahman, the greater than the greatest,
like
Paramatma, you know, smaller than the charming medium-sized Lord, the very specific concrete vision, but at the same time the most universal, we say, you know, I mean, so there's also, I mean, of course, there are other forms of conservatism as well that are like, you know, that are more like bigotry at times, but you know, but I'm in the context of Saraswati Thakura and Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakura and Srila Prabhupada, we're dealing with it in a different realm, you know, and what conservative and liberal means, and that. Anyways, yeah. So that's a
cool. Thank you. I've always wondered why, although Rabindranath Tagore and Bhaktivinoda Thakur were contemporaries, or at least within the same era, one has fame not only in Bengal but around the world, and the other is more known around the West, perhaps than even in his birthplace.
Okay, at least in the same area. One is fame not only in Bengal but around the world, and the other is more known around the West, perhaps than even in his birthplace. Yeah, so we're talking about Srila Bhakti, exactly, Bhaktivinoda Thakur there. Yeah, it's. I mean, I would. It's, you know, this. Ultimately, Bhaktivinoda Thakur is propounding a religion that requires commitment.
Right. Good point. Yeah.
I would say commitment, affiliation, surrender. Sharanagati. He's writing about Sharanagati.
Right.
You know, I mean, this is not an easy thing. You know, Amar Jivana, Shadapaperot. You know, this is painful at times. Tagore, and of course, Bhaktivinoda Thakur knew Rabindranath and knew his elder brother, Dwijendranath, very, very well as well. You know, they were very good friends. He called him Bodo Dada. He referred to Tagore's older brother as Bodo Dada, and he would spend time in the Tagore family home at Jorashankar, the Thakur Bari. But Tagore himself, of course, is also drawing on heavily Vaishnav themes and also in his Banu Shringhar Padavali, the form of Vaishnav Padavali, and his later writing, the content of Vaishnav poetry, Vaishnav themes. But drawing on it, but in a looser way, in a more accessible humanist way, perhaps. That doesn't require the same kind of commitment. It's and it's true that there was a book written by one Kashinath Mukhopadhyay, who is associated with the Sri Caitanya Gaudiya Math, I believe it is, who or maybe I got that much, I forget. Anyways, the institute doesn't really matter. But he talks in there about how even in Bengal, Bhaktivinoda Thakur and his literary glory, because he was an amazing writer, is not known very well outside of Vaishnav circles because of the fact that he's writing on specifically Vaishnav themes.
Okay.
But I would say that back in the late 19th century, he was actually a lot more well known, and the early 20th century, he was a lot more well known in Bengal than maybe he is today. That's
Cool.
for sure.
Yeah. Would you like to gloss on the question of caste that was restricting the spread of Vaishnavism, and Mayapur was also a part of freeing it from the fetters or the traditional modes of dissemination? This is from another scholar.
Yeah. This is my buddy, I believe. Off you go. Yes. Dandavad. I'd like to gloss on the question of caste that was restricting this. Yeah, that's definitely that was definitely the case. I haven't actually explored that issue greatly, in the context of my work. Although I do know that Bhaktivinoda Thakura. So we hear about the Jat Vaishnav. This is getting into the specifics, but Abhishek, I'm speaking to you directly now, if you don't mind. Yes. I was reading recently that so these Jat Vaishnavs, these Jati Vaishnavs, who are a sub-caste without Varna. They're a Jati without a Varna. They're just Vaishnav, and they've fallen beyond Varnashram Dharma. And then there's a whole sort of history of those in the context of Bengal and the religious life of Bengal. But in the 19th century, they were sort of organizing themselves as a Jati, and really campaigning against casteism. And Bhaktivinoda Thakur, so one of the leaders of that campaign, it was Madhusudan Das Adhikari, who is actually, as you know, Abhishek, Bhaktivinoda Thakur's close friend, right? And there's also Joe O'Connell has written on this, on what was going on in the and I've realized now that actually it would be very interesting to look at what's going on in that context to understand. I think it has implications even for the way that we understand, because all those debates were going on in that context, the relationship between Vaishnav and Brahmin, and this is around 1911, so 1910, 1911. So I think there's, Abhishek, maybe you're more equipped and qualified than I to do that kind of work. So
I'll be in touch. We should have him on the show too.
Yeah, we should get show too.
Yeah, all right, we'll be in touch. Okay, let's move on here. How can I get his thesis? I would like to buy it. Kalki Das. Is it for sale? Or you're ready? Yeah, your thesis. You're writing.
That's not for sale at the moment. I'm turning that into a book. But I've got a bunch of articles, a few articles that are available online. If you look up my name, Lucian Wong, Lucian L-U-C.
I'll put it on the screen later. Yeah.
Yeah. Put it on the screen. Yeah.
Okay. When did the Gaudiya line become sannyas dominant?
Yeah. That's in. That's really Saraswati Thakur's kind of introducing that institution into Gaudiya Vaishnavism. Although, having said that, there is another associate of Bhaktivinoda Thakur called Radhikanath Goswami, who was co-editor of the Vishnupriya Patrika alongside Bhaktivinoda Thakur, and is a prominent representative of the Advaita Vangsha in the late 19th century, great pundit as well. And he retires to Vrindavan and writes a text called Jati Darpan, which is all about validating the institution of sannyas within the Gaudiya tradition. And this is like in like 19, I think again, like something like 1913 or something around that time. So it also, whether that's indicative of a broader discourse, I haven't encountered anything else yet, but there are precursors to what Saraswati Thakur did. But really the introduction of Tridandi sannyas in the context of is really a Gaudiya Mat. That's a Gaudiya Mat thing. And at that time, and then we see and that's also associated with, of course, Daivi Varnashram Dharma, a kind of almost like a social project as well. It wasn't just about when you get to Saraswati Thakur, and even in Bhaktivinoda Thakur a bit, but then really in Saraswati Thakur, there's almost like a social agenda as well, to transform society, into something somewhat more conducive to the cultivation of bhakti by the institution of a proper conception of Varnashram Dharma. And then that's also that then of course goes in line with a stronger narrative against caste Goswamis, etc.
Cool. Interested to know about the other contemporary Vaishnavas of Bhaktivinoda's time, such as Bijoy Krishna Goswami, Radha Charan Das Babaji, and Samaj Bari. And are there any comments by the Thakur on Ram Krishna Paramahamsa? This is a very technical question.
Okay, yeah, again, so I got all the scholars online. It's funny. So the second question first. So the Thakur and Ramakrishna Paramahamsa. I was working with Abhishek actually back in like 2011. We were going through the Shajantoshini. I forget what it's called. There's a book review that deals with a text that's the Tattva or something like that, that's come out of those sort of Ramakrishna Paramahamsa circles. And Bhaktivinoda Thakur in there mentions this pujari, from in South Calcutta, the Kali temple in Calcutta, and his how he's gaining he hasn't become the great Ramakrishna Paramahamsa yet. I don't think, or maybe it's beginning to, but he mentions there that this, and it's a curious. He kind of like the tone is somewhat curious and kind of like he's withholding judgment on Ramakrishna Paramahamsa at that point. And I haven't actually come across anything else in the Shajantoshini, though there certainly may well be. In terms of Bijoy Krishna Goswami and Radha Charan Das Babaji and Samaj Bari. So I actually haven't seen any mention in Bhaktivinoda's writings of Bijoy Krishna Goswami or rather Charan Das Dev Babaji. But I mean, actually, sorry, no, there is in a biography of Bhaktivinoda Thakur by, I believe it's Krishna Das, there's mention of Radha Charan Das Dev, and not very favorable. Interestingly, when I was speaking to, sorry, as a somewhat side note, when I was speaking to a Babaji called Kishori Das Babaji in Bengal, near Kumarhatta, and I was asking him about the 19th century. His, and I'm not saying that this is gospel or anything. I'm just saying that in the eyes of more like traditional Goswamis and Babajis, Radha Charan Das Dev, and he said in the 19th century, he said there was a lot of hodgepodge going on. He's speaking in Bengali. A lot of hodgepodge going on, and he named three. Bhaktivinoda, Radha Raman Charan Das Dev, and Jagat Bandhu Sundar. He says they have no bishesh bhajan, no bishesh bhajan. They're not following the prachin dhara, the ancient current. That was the conception of. But there's definitely Bhaktivinoda Thakur is definitely associating with devotees who are part of those broader networks of Vaishnavas in the 19th and early 20th centuries.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, Siddha Pranali was presented by Thakur Bhaktivinoda in Harinam Chintamani and Jaiva Dharma, and his demise thereafter. What happened? Okay, this is like a whole podcast, but really like 30 seconds.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
I don't know if you can do that, but
yeah. Well, interestingly, so yeah, it features in Bhaktivinoda Thakur, in those texts that you mentioned. Interestingly, even in Bipin Bihari Goswami's works, there are warnings. There are warnings. So this isn't also just a critique coming from the Gaudiya Math associated figures, but there are warnings about the too easy distribution of these things to people, by disciples who are not qualified by gurus who are not qualified to disciples who are not qualified. There's that. So come the Gaudiya Math, of course, at least as I understand it, this has come to me through my own particular religious institution, that on that, a nice sort of summary of Saraswati, the Gaudiya Math's position on this and that Saraswati Thakura composed a song for when they were moving the Gaudiya Math from Ultadingi Junction to Bagh Bajar, and one of the sort of couplets in that song, Mattala Harijana. Pujala Ragapata Gaudava Bange. Yeah, exactly.
I know that one from.
Exactly. But it's like, that's it's an interesting conception. I think that there encapsulates the relationship of Gaudiya Math thinking to the path of Raganuga sadhana. That actually,
it's always.
Exactly. And the word there is Gaudava Bange. Sometimes is wrongly translated as Bange, breaking Gaudava. Like we break the god of worshipping the Ragapot and intoxicated in either in kirtan or the Bishaya Range is somewhat. I won't go into that. That's a bit complex. But essentially Yukta Vairagya, utilizing the things of this world. But actually the word there, Bange, is short for Bangite. Bangi is in the posture. As a posture of Gaudava, the path of Vaidhi, in the the Shravanam Kirtan, that in that posture we worship the Ragapat. So actually, the conception of the as far as I understand it, and I hope I'm not misrepresenting here, the Gaudiya Math followers is that they are actually practicing Raganuga. They're on the path of on the Ragapat, by. As that is their ideal. Of course, others would who see it differently, would contest that. And
sure.
That's another discussion, though. I'm not going to go into it here.
Great, beautiful. I love that answer.
Yeah.
Very nice.
Yeah.
Bhaktivinoda Thakura was the first prominent Gaudiya Vaishnav to engage with Christianity. Can you tell us something about his views on Christianity and how that could shape modern Gaudiya Vaishnav's relationship with Christianity?
Yeah, so Bhaktivinoda Thakura had very close relationships with, exactly as you're indicating here, with Christians, from his early school days, all the way. Well, I actually know he says actually early on that he preferred the mood of Christ much more to what was going on in the Brahmo tradition, which was very dry, sort of dry worship, he called it, and there was he discerned rasa. Even at times he says that. And of course we know in texts like, so in an earlier version of the Krishna Samhita, he refers to, called the Dattaka Stupa, which was actually, I think, envisioned as, there was this short version and the Krishna Samhita was going to be the extended version of that text, but ended up being something else. In the Dattaka Stupa, he delineates a system, based on Panchayatana Puja, where there's the Shaktas, Sauras, Ganapatyas, Shaivas, and Vaishnavas, these fivefold traditions, as kind of like categories for forms of religion in the world, and he of course groups Christians underneath Vaishnavas, he considers them Vaishnavas, and then in elsewhere in his Krishna Samhita, he even speaks of where that system appears again. He speaks of Christ and Moses as being able to bestow certain forms of rasa, even, so Vatsalya rasa mixed with awe and reverence in the context of Jesus, and Dasya rasa in the context of in relation to Moses.
Wow.
Well, yeah, he says that. So it's like, wow, that's like really, there's real parity there between tradition. But then this is one of the things that I do in my work, tracing the transitions. But he doesn't do that across the board, actually. There are later works such as his, and Abhishek has worked quite a bit on this text, the Tattva Vivek, a philosophical treatise, where he groups Christianity and Christian doctrine within the first category of those that have been born from our conditioned nature, those views that have been born from our conditioned nature, and then also sort of like talks about the notion of like, the Garden of Eden and the fall from that eating as actually irrational. Quite, I forget exactly, but it's quite disparaging. And then in his Prem Pradeep, even earlier than that, there's mixed views with regard to Christianity. So, but it's complicated. It's really complicated. There's like, so, and I see this actually in relation to, I see the transition in Bhakti. So early on in Bhaktivinoda, a kind of easy universalization of, Vaishnavism and an accommodating of different positions very easily within Vaishnava systems, inclusivism as we know it in scholarship and the theology of religions, whereby you accommodate what you see in another, but you subordinate it to your own system. So you can always give something a place within your thought, by putting Jesus on like, Vatsalya rasa mixed with, there's it's acknowledging great parity, but at the same time subordinating ultimately. But in the context of earlier Gaudiya Vaishnavism, we have analogously, how do we deal with Islam? How do texts like the Caitanya Charitamrita deal with Islam? Well, there are conflicting treatments of Islam in the text. On the one hand, there are passages like Mahaprabhu's encounter with the pir, the Sufi pir, says actually no, Quran teaches, is teaching, truth is teaching ultimately that, that Krishna is God, essentially, the Lord is blackish, and, et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, in his encounter with the Kaji, no, this is Kalpana Shastra. It's adunik, it's modern, and it's imagined. This is not, there's like ambivalence. There's both wanting to accommodate and find parity, but at the same time, not fully being able to accommodate and actually being quite, and so I actually see what's going on in Bhaktivinoda Thakura is really some of that ambivalence starts to appear with regard to other faiths in his later thought. Not that he's like disrespectful in any ways, like to say that Christianity can bestow rasa, that's a huge thing to say. If you think about like, what do we need to do to experience rasa in our tradition? Ultimately Raganuga sadhana bhakti, and it's very specific. Do you know what I mean? So it's like, anyhow, there's
right. Yeah, thank you. I'm going to pick and choose now because we're running out of time. We're coming close to the end, but I'm going to pick questions that I'm interested in. Cool. Okay, let's see here. This is interesting to me. Can you tell us something about the split among the followers of Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakura, Srila Saraswati Thakura, and Lalita Prasad Thakura? What were some of the points of contention?
Yeah, I think partly it hinges on, again, this place of Siddha Pranali within the tradition. Saraswati Thakura being much more guarding, if at all, he accommodates it at all. There's different views on that. And Lalita Prasad, obviously, fully practicing that. And also, one of the, a famous article by Saraswati Thakura about, it's quite condemning actually of Lalita Prasad Thakura, about how, this is Babha, Badha, Radha, or something like that. I forget, how Lalita Prasad conceived of his father in a somewhat more mundane way. This is from the vision of Saraswati Thakura, as father, a more, Saraswati Thakura is as guru. Of course, there's also the notion of the, what you make of that. Leave it to others to decide. I'm not coming down on that either way in the context of this talk. There's also, of course, Lalita Prasad, in line with his practice of Siddha Pranali, also still in his altar and in the Guru Parampara features Bipin Bihari Goswami and all the way, and also all the Goswaminis, all those female gurus that ultimately, all the way up to Janava, Matta, etc. Those are still appearing there. In terms of, I haven't studied Lalita Prasad in any depth, so I don't have. I'm not really qualified to speak on that subject.
Sure.
Although I have, anyways, but so that's my short response. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well,
Lalita Madhava Prabhu is going to call you. Lalita Madhava, thank you so much for joining me on. It was a very fascinating discussion, and I'm so glad that you're doing this. There's someone in this field. I know there's many other devotees doing this, but to get a little bit of a taster from you about what it kind of is and how one actually, what kind of getting in your mind about how you did that evolution. But if you want to please leave us with some closing statements, some closing statement, I guess, about.
Yeah. Oh God, yeah. I've seen you do this to other people. I never know what to say in this context.
I know. I put people on the spot. I'm sorry about that.
I think maybe if there's anything. Okay, I know. I'll quote again. One of my favorite Western philosophers, Paul Ricoeur, says in terms of his own faith. He was a Christian. But I think it's also so the way that I've seen my engagement with academia, and I think this can be applied to not just in academia but other things in terms of challenging ourselves, putting us, like engaging with other voices, with other, being a bit more dialogical in terms of our approach to our spiritual life, that we can learn, and we can be enriched from engagement with others and other things, so the recurrent quote goes something along a contingency, i.e., by virtue of his birth, he's a Christian, born in a Christian family, just that's a complete random fact, transformed into a destiny by a choice constantly renewed. So always in the scrupulous openness to the plurality of voices, a choice constantly renewed in the scrupulous openness to the plurality of voices. My Christianity, my Vaishnavism, I think that there's a lot to be gained from putting ourselves, from challenging ourselves, putting, to be a bit, this notion sometimes, one other message I would say, there's a notion of preaching. I know we've all got issues with that maybe sometimes, but it's it's very monological. Just I got a message, I'm gonna, but there's something to be learnt actually from others. That radical fact.
Beautiful.
With a karmis or whatever you want. There's something to be learnt everywhere, really. We can always grow from these encounters.
To make ourselves deeper.
Yeah, exactly.
Love it.
That's thank you very much. I have to say that I really feel that coming on here is there's nothing really more to achieve in life other than maybe Krishna Prem, Guru Bhakti. My brother, I got my PhD. A few weeks ago. My brother was like, "Oh, well done." He heard I was on the Nama Ras podcast. He wrote to, "Oh my God, wow, Lucian's on the Nama Ras podcast."
Oh man, that's funny. That's hilarious. Well, thank you, Lalita Madhava Prabhu. If someone wants to get in touch with you, you said that could they get on Facebook?
Yeah. So my name, my legal, exactly. Yeah. Put it up there briefly and then bam.
Briefly, yes.
Yeah.
So if you want to get in touch with them, you could get in touch with them on Facebook. Again, thank you for listening and thank you for joining me. That was a very fascinating discussion of Bhaktivinoda Thakura. If you have any suggestions, please send them to me and please follow my Facebook page and share this podcast. I'm on YouTube, Facebook, Spotify, Google, Apple, everywhere you can find podcasts. That's the Late Morning Program. Again, thank you, Lalita Madhava Prabhu. Stay on. I'm going to turn off the live. Very well.